On the morning of June 22nd, 1941, a German corporal named Alfred Liskow swam across the Prut River and surrendered to Soviet border guards. He was terrified. He told them everything. The invasion was scheduled for that night, at 3 a.m, along the entire length of the frontier. He gave them unit positions. He gave them the signal codes. He begged them to warn their commanders. The information was passed up the chain. It reached senior officers. Those senior officers had a problem. Months earlier, Stalin had personally announced that intelligence reports warning of a German invasion were British provocations designed to drag the Soviet Union into war. Officers who had forwarded such reports had been summoned, humiliated, and in some cases arrested. One intelligence chief had already been removed and placed under surveillance for continuing to insist the threat was real. So when Alfred Liskow's warning arrived, the Red Army's leadership faced a choice that had already been made for them. Some tried to move units quietly. Some issued unauthorized alerts. Most did nothing because doing something was more dangerous to their survival than doing nothing. At 3:15 in the morning, Germany opened the largest military offensive in human history. Within 6 hours, the Soviet Air Force had lost 1,200 aircraft, most of them still on the ground. Within 3 days, the Wehrmacht had advanced 200 miles. Within 3 weeks, Army Group Center had encircled 500,000 Soviet soldiers at Minsk. The question is not how Germany achieved this. The question is who made it possible. To understand what happened on June 22nd, 1941, you have to go back to a courtroom in Moscow on the evening of June 11th, 1937. Mikhail Nikolaevich Tukhachevsky was seated before a closed military tribunal. He was 44 years old, Marshal of the Soviet Union, First Deputy Commissar of Defense, and by nearly every serious assessment, Soviet or foreign, the most gifted military mind in the Red Army. He had spent the previous decade redesigning how the Soviet Union would fight its next war. Not infantry charges, not static trenches, mobile armoured formations striking deep into enemy territory, collapsing supply lines, creating chaos behind the front before the enemy could respond. He called it deep battle theory, and it was exactly how modern industrial warfare would be fought. He had also spent the previous year under suspicion. The NKVD, Stalin's secret police, had assembled a dossier. It claimed Tukhachevsky was a German agent, that he had been secretly coordinating with Wehrmacht officers, that he was the center of a vast military conspiracy to overthrow the Soviet government and open the borders to fascist invasion. The dossier had been signed by Tukhachevsky himself, under conditions that remain documented, his signature written in ink that forensic analysis would later confirm was mixed with blood. The tribunal lasted 1 day. 8 of the 9 judges were themselves arrested within 2 years. Tukhachevsky was shot the following morning, June 12, 1937. He was executed with 7 of his closest colleagues. Within weeks, the purge of the Red Army's officer corps began in earnest. Over the next 18 months, 3 of 5 marshals of the Soviet Union were shot. 13 of 15 army commanders were shot. 50 of 57 corps commanders were shot. 154 of 186 division commanders were shot or imprisoned. In total, somewhere between 35,000 and 40,000 officers were removed from the Red Army. The exact figure remains disputed, because the records of what was done to them were themselves carefully managed. What is not disputed is the result. An army of millions was left without the men who knew how to lead it. The purge did not happen in silence. Foreign military observers noticed. The French, the British, the Germans, all of them watched the systematic removal of an officer class and drew their own conclusions. The German High Command drew the most consequential one. In internal assessments from 1938 and 1939, Wehrmacht planners noted that the Red Army had been functionally decapitated. Its remaining leadership was inexperienced, politically cautious to the point of paralysis, and operating under a command culture where independent judgment had become a survival risk. To make a decision that turned out badly was dangerous. To make a decision without authorization was potentially fatal. This was not an accident of the purge, it was its product. Stalin did not simply want his officers dead, he wanted his officers afraid. An army whose commanders feared their own government more than they feared the enemy was an army Stalin could control. That the enemy might exploit this dynamic was a problem he had either not considered or had decided to manage later. The replacements came quickly. Young officers were promoted 3 and 4 ranks overnight, filling positions they had not been trained to hold. The institutional memory, the decades of tactical development, the relationships between commanders who had trained together, the informal networks through which armies actually function, was gone. What remained were men who had learned one thing above all others: do not stand out, do not disagree, do not act without authorization, and never, under any circumstances, deliver news that Stalin did not wish to hear. By 1940, the consequences were already visible. The Winter War against Finland began in November 1939 and was intended by Soviet planners to last 2 weeks. A small nation of 4 million people faced the largest country in the world. The Red Army suffered approximately 160,000 dead in a campaign that lasted 3.5 months against an opponent with a fraction of their resources. Entire divisions were encircled and destroyed. Basic coordination between infantry, armour and artillery, coordinated operations that Tukhachevsky had spent years developing and teaching, collapsed in the Finnish forests. The Mannerheim Line, a modest defensive system by European standards, held for weeks against assaults that should have overwhelmed it in days. German military observers watched the Winter War carefully. Their conclusion, entered into operational planning documents, was that the Soviet army was a colossus incapable of effectively using its own mass. Its officer corps was brittle, its communications poor, its commanders unwilling to adapt. The campaign that became Operation Barbarossa was built in part on this assessment. It was the correct assessment. Stalin had ensured that it would be. Through the spring of 1941, the intelligence warnings accumulated. They came from everywhere. Richard Sorge, the Soviet spy embedded in the German embassy in Tokyo, reported in mid-May that the invasion was scheduled for mid-June. He provided the exact operational axis. He was dismissed as a likely double agent. British intelligence, drawing on signals intercepts from the Ultra program, passed information through diplomatic channels indicating massive German force concentrations along the Soviet border. Stalin annotated the summary personally. British provocation. The head of Soviet military intelligence, Lieutenant General Philip Golikov, had assembled a report by April 1941, concluding that Germany would attack. Then he read the climate in which he was working and submitted a second report concluding that Germany would not attack. The second report was what Stalin wanted to hear. Golikov survived. His predecessor, General Ivan Proskурov, who had refused to shade his intelligence assessments, had already been removed, arrested, and was working toward a firing squad he would meet in October. On June 13, 1941, 9 days before the invasion, the Soviet news agency TASS published an official statement asserting that rumours of an impending German attack were groundless and provocative. The statement was designed in part for foreign consumption, but it also functioned as a directive to the Soviet military. Prepare for an attack that will not come and face consequences. Do not prepare and face consequences only if the attack does come. The mathematics were clear to every officer who had survived 1937 and 1938. On June 18th, German reconnaissance aircraft were conducting low-altitude flights over Soviet positions in broad daylight, photographing what they would need to destroy. On June 19th, German engineers were quietly marking lanes through minefields along the border. Forward German infantry were moving into their assault positions under the cover of darkness. Soviet border units filed reports. The reports travelled up chains of command and disappeared. On June 21st, at approximately 9 in the evening, a second German defector, Sergeant Heinrich Schrader, crossed the Soviet lines and confirmed what Alfred Liskow would repeat 3 hours later. The attack was imminent. The exact time was known. The exact axes were known. At his headquarters that night, the commander of the Kiev Special Military District, Mikhail Kirponos, drafted a preliminary order to move forces to defensive positions. He stopped himself. He had not received authorization. He sent a request for authorization to Moscow. Moscow did not respond. Across the entire western frontier of the Soviet Union, commanders who knew what was coming chose not to act on what they knew, because acting on what they knew without Stalin's permission was more immediately dangerous than being overrun. At 3:15 on the morning of June 22nd, the artillery opened. The first hours of Barbarossa did not unfold like a battle. They unfolded like a controlled demolition. German bombers crossed the border simultaneously at 66 airfields. The targeting had been prepared over weeks of reconnaissance. Aircraft were lined up in rows. Stalin had actually ordered that aircraft not be dispersed, believing dispersal would signal aggression. At Bialystok, at Minsk, at Grodno, Soviet planes burned on the tarmac before their pilots had reached the cockpits. The Luftwaffe flew multiple sorties that day. By evening, Soviet Air Force strength in the western districts had been reduced by roughly 60%. The figure in some sectors was worse. On the ground, 3 German army groups drove forward on axes that the Soviet defensive doctrine, the doctrine that had replaced Tukhachevsky's framework, had not been designed to counter. Soviet defensive doctrine, revised after the purge, emphasized fixed positions and counterattack. It assumed that any German advance would be limited. It did not anticipate armoured formations moving 40, 50, 60 kilometres a day, bypassing strong points and encircling entire field armies from behind. Tukhachevsky had anticipated exactly this. His deep battle theory was built to both execute and defend against precisely this kind of warfare. The officers he had trained had understood it. Those officers were dead, imprisoned, or so thoroughly conditioned to silence that their knowledge had become inert. The commanders who remained issued orders. Many of those orders were based on information that was hours out of date by the time they arrived. Units that had been ordered to hold positions were already encircled. Units ordered to counterattack moved forward into the rear of advancing German columns and were destroyed. The communication system, telephone lines, radio nets, was disrupted in the first hours, and the command culture that had been cultivated since 1937 made improvisation almost impossible. Officers waited for orders, orders did not come, units stood in place and were flanked. In the northern sector, Army Group North broke through toward Leningrad at a speed that Soviet planners had calculated was mechanically impossible for a modern army to sustain. The calculation had been correct for the Soviet army. It was not correct for the Wehrmacht. In the central sector, Generals Hoth and Guderian drove their panzer groups in a pincer movement toward Minsk. The Red Army formations between them, the Western Front under General Dmitry Pavlov, had not been deployed to stop a double envelopment. They were positioned to advance, not to defend, because Soviet doctrine held that the enemy would be destroyed on his own territory. When the encirclement closed on June 28th, approximately 325,000 Soviet soldiers were trapped inside. Another 90,000 were captured at Bialystok days before. Pavlov's command, one of the most powerful formations in the Red Army, had been effectively destroyed in 6 days. Stalin, at his dacha in Kuntsevo, received reports through the first day that were confused, contradictory, and in many cases simply wrong, because the officers producing them did not know what was happening and were afraid to admit it. His response to the first hours was to demand counterattacks, massive counterattacks, immediately, to drive the Germans back. The counterattacks were ordered. They were executed by units that had already suffered catastrophic losses, without air cover, without coordination, without accurate intelligence about where the German spearheads were. They died by the tens of thousands, achieving nothing. On June 29th, Stalin drove to the People's Commissariat of Defense. What he found there, by accounts recorded later by Politburo members who were present, broke something in him. The High Command did not know where the front was. They did not know which units still existed. They did not know how to find out. The communications infrastructure was gone, and the officer class that might have improvised alternatives had been systematically eliminated 4 years earlier. He returned to his dacha, and by multiple accounts, did not leave for approximately 2 days. When Politburo members arrived on June 30th to discuss forming a state defense committee, one of those present later recorded that Stalin asked, quietly, whether they had come to arrest him. He had helped create a military incapable of defending the country it was supposed to protect, and some part of him understood it. The search for someone to blame began before the dust had settled. General Dmitry Pavlov was arrested on July 4th, 1941, 12 days after the invasion. He was brought to Moscow, interrogated, and charged with cowardice, failure of command, and dereliction of duty. His chief of staff, his signals officer, and 2 other senior commanders of the Western Front were arrested with him. Pavlov's trial lasted 1 day. He was given almost no opportunity to present a defence, partly because his defence would have consisted of demonstrating exactly what had been done to the Red Army's command structure over the 4 preceding years. He was shot on July 22nd, 1941, 1 month after the invasion began. He was one of the men Stalin had promoted rapidly after the purge. He had been given command of a front for which he did not have the training or experience that the men who had previously held such commands possessed. He had been forbidden to prepare adequate defences because doing so would have implied that an attack was coming, which Stalin had declared impossible. He had been unable to respond to the German breakthrough because the communication systems had been destroyed and the command culture had been engineered to prevent exactly the kind of independent action that might have limited the damage. He was shot for all of these things which had been done to him. The official Soviet narrative that emerged, maintained through the war years and beyond, was that the initial disasters of June 1941 resulted from German treachery, the suddenness of the attack and the failures of individual commanders who had panicked or betrayed their posts. Stalin's personal directives forbidding defensive preparations were not mentioned. The 4 years of systematic officer murders were treated as a separate matter, unrelated to military performance. The intelligence warnings that had been suppressed were classified. The TASS statement of June 13th was quietly removed from official accounts. In 1941 alone, the Red Army suffered approximately 4.5 million casualties, killed, wounded, and captured. The German prisoner of war system, unprepared for numbers of this scale, allowed several million Soviet prisoners to die of starvation and exposure in the following months. By December 1941, the Wehrmacht stood within sight of Moscow. The Soviet Union survived the war, but the cost of what happened in those first 6 months, a cost measured in human lives at a scale almost incomprehensible to modern understanding, was not the result of German military brilliance alone. It was the result of a deliberate, systematic dismantling of the institution that was supposed to prevent it. Mikhail Tukhachevsky was posthumously rehabilitated in 1957, 4 years after Stalin's death. The word rehabilitation, in Soviet legal terminology, meant that his conviction was reviewed and found to have been based on fabricated evidence. The charges were false. He had not been a German spy. He had not conspired against the Soviet government. He had been framed, tortured, and shot. The official acknowledgement of this came in a 16-page document that was not widely published and was not discussed publicly for decades. The NKVD files released in subsequent years revealed what had been done and how. The evidence had been fabricated. The confessions had been extracted under conditions that forensic examination confirmed included physical violence. The entire structure of the accusation had been a construction designed to eliminate officers whose loyalty to the state was not in question, but whose professional independence was. Tukhachevsky had been precisely the kind of general the Soviet Union needed in June 1941. He had studied German military development obsessively. He had understood mechanized warfare at a conceptual level that none of his successors matched. He had built training programs and doctrinal frameworks that would have produced, by 1941, an officer class familiar with mobile operations, combined arms coordination, and the kind of flexible decision-making that the first days of Barbarossa demanded. He had done all of this, and he had been shot for it, and the work had been buried with him. The deep irony, the irony that sits at the centre of everything that followed, is that Tukhachevsky was shot on the accusation of aiding Germany. His execution aided Germany more than any spy could have done. The intelligence his death generated, the assessment that confirmed the Red Army was leaderless and culturally incapable of effective resistance, became a foundational premise of the operational planning that produced Barbarossa. Germany did not simply benefit from his absence. Germany had, in a very specific sense, been handed a military assessment worth more than any secret document. The man accused of giving the Wehrmacht an advantage was shot. The man who actually gave the Wehrmacht an advantage signed the execution order. There is a question that the official histories have always been careful not to answer directly. Stalin received, by conservative estimates, more than 80 separate intelligence reports in the 6 months before June 22, 1941, warning of an impending German invasion. The reports came from agents in Germany, from diplomatic sources in neutral countries, from technical analysis of German supply movements, and from direct observation of German force concentrations along the Soviet border. They identified the operational axes. Several identified the approximate date. One identified the specific date and the specific time. Every one of these reports was dismissed, suppressed, or punished. The commanders who tried to prepare were threatened. The officers who warned their superiors were arrested. The general who compiled the clearest intelligence picture and presented it accurately was replaced by one who presented it inaccurately. The army that was supposed to defend the country was told, through 4 years of systematic murder and one final official news agency statement, that it did not face the threat it faced. When the threat arrived, the army could not respond. The men who knew how to respond were dead. The men who had replaced them had learned that knowledge was dangerous and silence was survival. The system that had been built to protect the Soviet state had instead produced the conditions for the most catastrophic military defeat in Russian history. This was not a failure of intelligence. This was not a failure of nerve. This was the logical consequence of a system built to serve one man's absolute control over information, authority, and military power. And the bill came due on a June morning when the artillery opened along a 2,000-mile front. Tukhachevsky had been dead for 4 years by then. His doctrines had been discarded. His students had been shot. His warning, implicit in everything he had built, everything he had written, everything he had tried to prepare, had been sealed in a file, soaked in blood, and buried under 1,600 miles of advancing German armour. The numbers that came after are historical facts. 3.5 million Soviet soldiers were captured in 1941 alone. Cities reduced to rubble, villages erased, a country that lost, before the war ended, somewhere between 27 and 30 million people. All of it began with a man who understood exactly what was coming, and the man who was supposed to protect the country from it had shot him first.